connectors. Alrighty. So we have four basic types of connectors with EmpowerID. You got your stock connectors. Those are the ones that ship where the fully defined connectors, fully defined system connection definitions, like for Active Directory, SAP, Salesforce, where we simply have a UI that walks you through a wizard to configure it. You give your connection strings, your server, your endpoint, stuff like that, and it simply configures it. We're going to configure an Active Directory one here in just a little bit. So those are our stock connectors. We got a whole bunch of these out there. I've got a page here that has a little hard to read, but this is kind of the marketing page that we give everybody.
And that's about 6 years old. It's just nobody had the interest in finding all the logos again. So
yeah. So there's a bunch of stock connectors. So just about every flavor of SAP we can connect to. All day folks are very familiar with that. Lots of SAP systems. Well, it's basically a ton of different standard system connectors. Basically, is what we've got. Okay, the next one, we have universal connectors. Now we have a universal no-code flat file connector, which we're going to be configuring. And that is basically, it's a wizard workflow you can run through. You tell it what your file is that you're ingesting. You give it a mappings file that says, this is the schema I want to use. And it operates after that, it operates just like a standard connector where it'll do periodic inventory of that flat file. It just uses that flat file as a resource system, basically, to bring data in. And we can also, on those flat file connectors, we can have an outbound, so we can actually put files out there for our system an external system to ingest. So it's just a way that you can, for systems that we don't have out-of-the-box stock connectors for, and you want to go ahead and just configure something on your own without having to do any coding, you can do, if you can get a flat file out, then you can just simply create a flat file connector to bring the data in. And then we have a universal connector database based. Now, the universal connector, if it's database based, we give you a very well-defined intermediate database on our server, right? That has just a few tables and it's well documented. And so it's got like a users table, a locations table, a role table, a group table, a group account table, things like that, well documented. And so as an alternative to the universal flat file connector, if you have a DBA in your organization or a DBA from an application, you want to do a connector from EmpowerID, you can have them get the data. You just do some sort of automation job to pull the data from your external system, shove it into this intermediate connector database that we have. And then EmpowerID has the definitions all set up. You can just simply create a new connector through the UI, through the workflow, and point it to that connector database, and it just sucks it right in. So it's two ways that you can do kind of a universal connector, which allows you to basically do any system you want. So you get the data out of your other system in some standard format, and then it's a simple configuration for us just to bring it right into the system. All right. We have custom connectors. Custom connectors are what they say they are. You can go into Workflow Studio and you can write code. We have templates that you can use, and this is something that you get into in the developer training for the connector track. Basically, we have templates. You start with a template. It gives you all the placeholders and everything in there, establishes the initial library, and then you just go in and you define for the connector what the various method calls are for the various processes you want to do. So you want to create a user. You say use this method call. I'm going to hit this sort proc. I'm going to use this API call, whatever. And you basically define your connector methods, and you configure your connector. So that's done through Workflow Studio, and it's ultimately the most it's the most complex, but it's also the most flexible, because you can code whatever you want in there. You're just writing C# code. All right. You don't have to import anything once you create the custom connector through Workflow Studio, through that whole deployment process inside Workflow Studio, the CI/CD deployment process. There's Git involved and stuff like that. It simply becomes available in the UI to then configure. Yep. Typically, if you're going to do customization, then yes, you would need, and workflows too, basically it's an app you can run on your workstation, connect to the database, and it gives you the tools to be able to do workflows. Yeah. And then finally, the newest one we have is the SCIM microservice framework connectors. I'll let Patrick talk about this one, because he loves the SCIM connector.
It's just a standard. It's a REST API standard by the industry for if you're going to expose your identity data for identity management of the systems, then your app can implement SCIM, and then it has a well-defined list of endpoints and schema where other vendors like Microsoft and EmpowerID, if we understand SCIM, we should be able to manage your app. That way it makes you don't have to create custom connectors for every system. So vendors like EmpowerID or Azure will have an out-of-the-box SCIM connector. So any app that supports SCIM, then they should be able to connect to it without custom code, just with configuration. So the idea was behind the SCIM connector was not many people know how to write SCIM for their apps. So it wasn't getting adopted very well, slow. And then not a lot of people know how to write an EmpowerID connector. So we thought, why don't we make something where you don't really need to know how to write an EmpowerID connector and you don't need to know how to write SCIM. So we made a SCIM microservice template. So it's a microservice. We have a .NET version and we have a Java version. I don't know if anybody uses the Java version, but it's a .NET Core app. It's a SCIM 2.0 microservice server. And basically you can pop it out with the template, and then you just plug in your method calls to how to get users, create users, and it exposes it as SCIM. That way we can just connect to it without code. So it makes it easy. You could farm out connector development, and they don't have to know EmpowerID, and they don't have to know SCIM. They just have to know for their app how to plug in the .NET code to get a user, create a user, update a user, the specifics of their app, which they should know. That's the idea.
Yep. In this admin training, we're going to do the out of the box stuff, and we're going to do a flat file connector. Alrighty. The nature of connectors, you can have a very simple connector that just goes and pulls users and groups, right? But EmpowerID has the ability with our connector framework that we can go extremely deep. So with SAP, with Azure, we can get down into the rights, the native rights in the system. We can go down like in SAP. We can go. You got your composite roles, your single roles, your simple roles, and you've got your T codes, all those rights and whatnot. We can actually bring all that stuff in. So our connector framework, depending on the nature of the connector that is we're using, can go extremely deep and get just about everything clear down to the role model of an external system. We do that specifically. Azure is a really good example of that. We are probably the deepest Azure connection in the industry. We can get everything to the RBAC roles, the AD roles, the subscriptions, application roles, service principals. We can manage all of that stuff within Azure. So just from a high level standpoint, if you want to do it, we can potentially do it. We probably already do. So, and then we're going to talk about the wizard-based code-free flat file connector. That's the one we're going to configure here in just a minute. And we're going to spend some time doing that. We'll talk about that more as we do it. We'll talk about the SCIM microservice connector. All right, just a quick summary or a definition as we start our connector work here of how we approach or the components we use, the things that we think about when we're talking about connectors, right? So at the basic level, we have our resources and our resource systems. Anytime we connect to an external system, we basically have a definition in our system, a connector definition in our system that defines the resource system. And it's basically the basic information about how we connect to that particular system. It's the definition of the resources in that system. Okay, so every connection we make will have in our resource system table, we'll have a record in there for that resource system that basically says what that system's all about, what type of stuff it has, things like that. So it's our resource system definitions. And when we're connecting to systems and when we're managing the stuff in EmpowerID that we're managing, we always refer to as resources. There's a table in our system called resources, every object that we manage in EmpowerID, it could be a role, a location, a user, a group, will have a basic record in our resources table that has the resource type that defines that resource, right? And so it'll have your basically it's the thing that says, hey, this thing exists. This is the type of thing it is. This is the unique ID for that in the entire system. When we refer to the type, that then goes back to a component table. Like if we have a resource in there in that table that says this is a user account, then you go back to the account table, and the account table will have all of the extended information that an account has, which is going to be different than the extended information that a group has. The group table is the back to that component concept, right? So we manage everything as a resource. That's the actual actionable object in EmpowerID. When we're doing RBAC assignments and whatnot, we're actually doing the RBAC assignment against resources, that resource table, right? And then the component tables exist simply to give us that extended definition of what exists for that particular thing. So account stores are basically special types of resource systems which contain user account, group, app roles. Often we refer to those as directories. Basically, if a resource system, if a system we're connecting to has identities that we need to manage, then we would create an account store definition for that resource system, right? So for instance, Exchange is a resource system, right? But it's not an account store. Exchange doesn't have its own identities. It uses identities from another account store, from Active Directory or from Azure AD, right? So it's just a resource system. A file share, if we're managing file shares, the server that gives us those file shares is simply a resource system. It has the resources, but we don't create an account store for it. Okay, so the account store definition basically extends the resource system definition by then further defining the information about the identities and the authentication processes and capabilities of that resource system. All right, so we'll have an account store record if that resource system has identities that we need to maintain and that we need to manage as part of that resource system. Okay, so that's kind of the difference between the account store definition and the resource system definition. It's a matter of what we're managing, because we can only put so much information in a particular definition, right? So going back to kind of the modular way, the same way we do jobs that are granular, that process certain things. We also have the way that we manage our data is very modularized. Components, the component concept here, right? We have the definition of the resource system, and at the base level, what it has, what it does, what we can do with it. And then the additional extended information about the identities that are in that are then stored in the account store table. Right. So every account store will have a corresponding resource system, but not necessarily every resource system will have a corresponding account store definition. Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's what we're going to do next. That's what we're going to do next. We're going to configure it. And then finally, the other concept we have is the security boundary, right? So we got lots of stuff. The security boundary, basically, let's get some water. The security, let's see, we'll stop here in a minute. Security boundary is basically, best way to define this. The security boundary basically identifies or defines the nature of the types of objects, the how we actually connect to those objects, how we define those objects, things like that. And it also serves as an umbrella that contains associated account stores, right? So for instance, thank you very much. So for instance, if you think about Active Directory, Active Directory has a forest, and then under that forest, there could be multiple domains, right? In our environment, the forest would be the security boundary. The domains would be the account stores, and then the associated resource systems with those. And if account stores belong to the same security boundary, we know in whatever system we're talking about, there's an implicit relationship between those account stores. We know, for instance, if it's a security boundary type as Active Directory, we know that if we have a security boundary and we have multiple account stores in there, that there's an implicit trust between those account stores. We know that we can put accounts from one account store that's in that security boundary into certain types of groups in another account store that's under that same security boundary, right? So it's a way that we can relate the systems together if there is a relationship inherent in those systems. Another example is SAP. SAP with the HR system in SAP. You've got your employee table, right? That's the records that we are managing as identities, right? You also have a user table, which defines the people that are allowed, the users that are allowed to actually log into and use the application. Well, for EmpowerID, those are two different account stores, right? So we'll manage the resources, we'll manage the employees as an account store, the records coming in. We know that those are HR records, they have identity information, etc. But then we'll also connect to the users and we'll have that be a separate account store. So we can manage the data coming in from that employees table as we're doing, but then we can have a provisioning policy that says, well, if you're in a particular role or if you have a particular role in this organization, then we can then provision a user account in the user table back the same way. So it's the same type of thing, but we know that there's a relationship between those two account stores within that security boundary of SAP, that particular SAP instance. Right? Now, what we do when we're managing the trust of an Active Directory system is we are not actually managing that trust, right? So when we establish that trust under our admin here, we have account store trust. All we're doing is we're telling EmpowerID what trust exists, right? So if you set up that trust in EmpowerID, it's not actually going out and creating that trust in the native environment, all right? But what it is doing is it's saying, what we're doing is we're introducing EmpowerID to an existing trust that already exists in the native environment. So if you have multiple forests and you have one-way trust between those two forests, between domains in that forest, and those two forests, we have a two-way trust or whatever. Within EmpowerID, there's something going on with the page there. So if you have a multi-forest environment and you have artificially configured trusts between the various forests, then EmpowerID needs to know that, because when we're dealing with those account stores, we need to know if a trust exists so that we know that, okay, we can put an account from this particular account store into a group in this particular account store because there's a trust existing that allows us to do that, right? So that's how you do that. So we're not actually we don't actually configure the trust in the native environment through EmpowerID. But here's like trusting domain, trusted domain. So you're basically introducing EmpowerID to the trust that already exists in the external system. All right. Okay. And then I get a picture. Woohoo! No, we don't inventory the trust configuration. We don't inventory that. You have to actually physically configure that in EmpowerID and then maintain it if things change in the native environment. Yeah.
Question. In a workflow, that when you're dealing with an external system object, it's important to note that EmpowerID doesn't, like, let's say you're modifying an account and that account exists in Active Directory. You're running a workflow and you try to edit an account, add an account to a group, it deals with what's called the live object, which is the account for identity entry, which is it represents a live object in an external system. And you'll deal with this in your connector workshop a lot. The way our model works is it's always transactional. We're always going to try to write to the external system through the live object and only record the change in EmpowerID SQL if it's successful. We don't write to EmpowerID and then something comes along and tries to make a change. So you won't ever end up with this disconnect where the data is not accurate in a workflow for a live transaction. It's only going to commit to SQL if it's successful in the external system. That's important to note, because not every system does it that way. And And then we get a bunch of weird questions later about that.
Yeah. Yeah. So if it's in our SQL, if there's an account object or account record in our SQL table, it's because it's been verified somehow. Either we read it in from the inventory, or when we created it, we had confirmation that it successfully wrote it out to the external system, and then we wrote it down into the SQL table. Now, later on, if that ever fails, so if we don't somehow get it written down in SQL, it really doesn't matter, because in the inventory cycle, we're going to go read it from Active Directory anyway. So we'll find it and we'll get that record updated. So the primary write happens on a workflow. Well, it's just when you're running a workflow, we have automated processes, policies, and stuff like that are creating things that queue up and then get written out. So then you'll have kind of a transactional kind of thing going on there. But if you're running a workflow and you say, I want to create an account, I want to edit account, update an account, whatever, the primary write's going to be out to that native environment first. We're going to write that down. If something fails, then when we go to try to write it back into SQL, we're going to pick that up later anyway through our inventory process. This just shows the relationship in a little bit more in kind of a diagram. That situation, the relationship between the security boundary, the account store, and the resource system. Now keep in mind, EmpowerID itself is a security boundary, it's an account store, and it's a resource system. The objects inside EmpowerID, in the account store of EmpowerID, you got your user accounts. Those are, you got the person objects. Those are our authenticated objects, right? Our identities, right? And so you have the account store that's in EmpowerID. You've got your resource system that's EmpowerID, and EmpowerID is in itself a security boundary type, right? But then, if we look down here, an example of a forest, an Active Directory forest. You've got your security boundary, which is the AD forest. You got two domains, would be two different account stores associated with that forest under that same security boundary. You got your resource system that corresponds to the domain. And you've got your exchange resource system that's corresponding to that domain, getting its accounts, its identity objects from the domain. And then you got a file server, okay? That's a resource system within that particular security boundary or within that account store. And then similarly, the example I gave of the HR system, where you've got your employees account store and your users account store and the associated security boundaries of those. All right, so just a way to pictorially represent the concepts of our resource system, account store, and security boundary architecture there. Right. Now, finally, we have a concept of applications. Important thing to remember is applications aren't systems in EmpowerID. Okay, you got your application object, which defines, it's kind of that same extended definition type of thing. You got your application. The application definition defines all the aspects of that application. Okay, what rights it can have, stuff like that. And the application will be associated with an account store, which represents the repository that application's identities and stuff are in, right? So when you create an application, you can create an account store with that application, or if you create an application, you can say that this application uses this account store, this repository. You could have an application that uses EmpowerID as its repository for identities and group objects and things like that, or you could have it could use Active Directory, or if it has its own repository. If you went and created an account, you created an account store connection, right, to say an external system, and you need to manage that system as an application as well, so that you can further define the objects and the items and the behavior of that system from the standpoint of an application that has behaviors and that has capabilities and such like that. You would create your account store for that system as an account store and resource system in EmpowerID. Then you would define your application, and you would say that this application uses this account store. Good. And if we have time, we'll actually take a look at maybe creating an app, tracking on the account store and such. But yeah, the important takeaway from this one is when we're talking about applications in EmpowerID, we're talking about that application object, and that's different from the account store definition. right? The account store definition is defining the identities, and then we simply say this app uses identities from or has identities in this particular account store. Okay, so it's two different things. And finally, we're going to touch briefly on this. We talked a little bit about tracking only account stores. Now, we might not be able to connect to every application, every account store out there, right? You know, so there might be some account stores, some external systems, applications that just don't lend themselves to be connected to, or they're so small, not used that often, so it doesn't make sense to spend the time and effort to try to create a custom connector to that application or whatever. But we do want to maintain some presence in EmpowerID where we can kind of manage and monitor who has access to it, things like that, and who has an account in it and whatnot. So we can create a track, what we call a tracking only account store. And it's basically an account store that's created inside EmpowerID. It only exists in EmpowerID, right? It doesn't have any connection to an external system. We create it, we can create accounts in it, we can create groups in it, we can put accounts into groups, and it's all internal to EmpowerID. And it basically is kind of an analog or a representation of the external system, right? We can combine that with some back-end business request processes so that if a business request in EmpowerID or process in EmpowerID creates an account in this tracking only account store, we can actually fire off a business request. We can actually fire off a business request that goes to somebody to say, hey, create this account in the external system, right? And then that person will then go and natively create that account in the external system. And then when they say approve on the business request, when they say completed on the business request, that signifies to us from an auditing standpoint that someone has actioned that request and has created that account or created that account group relationship in the external system. So it's not a direct linkage. There's no confirmation that it happened apart from a person saying, yes, I did it, right? But then at least in EmpowerID, we have a representation of that system. So if I go to a person object and I say, show me all the accounts that this person has, there is a record in there that says this person should have an account in this system because we created it in EmpowerID, and someone out there said that they did it. It's a stopgap. It's a not ideal way, but it does give us some visibility. And you can also do recertifications based on that also. So you can send a recertification out to say, does this account exist, right? So an account validity recertification, you can send it to the app owner, and you basically are asking the app owner, are these accounts valid? They can then look at their app, compare it, and then do a certification that yes, this account exists, this account exists, this account exists, this account exists. And that at least gives your auditors something to say, okay, at some point in time, some responsible person verified and validated that what's in here matches what's out there. We covered most of this stuff already. It's just key things to remember. Most applications are one-to-one with an account store, exception being what you had talked about. We can have more than one account store if we have to, manage, rights and stuff separate from the accounts. Typically, if application going to share an account store, you would typically have it pointed to EmpowerID instead of pointing to, say, so you have applications that are using Active Directory, right? Active Directory groups and stuff like that. You would still point that application to EmpowerID, and then you'd simply put the appropriate fulfillment groups and such in there. So okay, this is an Active Directory group, and et cetera, and you manage that through the fulfillment mechanisms that you put as fulfillment objects that you put out there. It's just an easier way to manage that, because otherwise, if you say that this application uses Active Directory as the account store, then if you go to that application, you say, show me the accounts associated with that application, it's going to show you all 70,000 users in Active Directory. And it gets very confusing. It's going to show you all 450,000 groups that are in Active Directory because you pointed to that system and said, this is your account store. when, it's just using a portion of those. So it's just from a manageability standpoint, you point it to Active Directory, you point it to EmpowerID as the account store, and then you manage your fulfillment mechanisms through the groups that you point to. We don't automatically create application objects when you create an account store. That's a separate definition. If you want an application associated with that account store, create the application. Right. And then during application onboarding, we select to create a tracking only account store. We're going to go ahead and we're going to create that logical account store in EmpowerID, that kind of representation of what's external. But that also gives us a place where we can put user accounts associated with that application, and we can actually maintain and manage relationships in there.